Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City by Matthew Desmond. However, we are done with the main section of the book and we are now beginning the epilogue. This will be a longer episode because I don't think I want to make the epilogue. It's like 20 pages. I don't know if it's no way. I want to make this an hour-long episode. So what we'll do, we'll read half the epilogue today. We'll read the other half of the epilogue on tomorrow's episode. And then after that, we will have a recap episode. And then we will begin reading a new book, which I believe is going to be, I don't know what it's going to be yet. So I shouldn't say what I believe it's going to be. I would ask people to please share a link of this episode on a social media platform, whether that's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever it is that you use. Remember, we put these episodes out on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pocket Casts, Anchor, YouTube, Facebook, SoundCloud, wherever podcasts are available. You can get episodes of this show. If you have not listened to previous episodes of Rockford Reading Daily, I would encourage you to please do that. And if by the time you get a hold of this, there are future episodes out, I would encourage you to listen to those future episodes as well. Now, let's dive into the epilogue of Evicted, which is entitled Home and Hope. The home is the center of life. It is a refuge from the grind of work, the pressure of school, and the menace of the streets. We say that at home, we can, quote, be ourselves, end quote. Everywhere else, we are someone else. At home, we remove our masks. The home is the wellspring of personhood. It is where our identity takes root and blossoms, where as children, we imagine, play, and question, and as adolescents, we retreat and try. As we grow older, we hope to settle into a place to raise a family or pursue work. When we try to understand ourselves, we often begin by considering the kind of home in which we were raised. In languages spoken all over the world, the word for, quote, home, end quote, encompasses not just shelter, but warmth, safety, family, the womb. The ancient Egyptian hieroglyph for, quote, home, end quote, was often used in place of, quote, mother, end quote. The Chinese word jia can mean both family and home. Quote, shelter, end quote, comes from two old English words. Sealed, meaning shield, and truma, meaning troop. Together forming the image of a family gathering itself within a protective shell. The home remains the primary basis of life. It is where meals are shared, quiet habits formed, dreams confessed, traditions created. Civic life, too, begins at home, allowing us to plant roots and take ownership over our community, participate in local politics, and reach out to neighbors in a spirit of solidarity and generosity. Quote, it is difficult to force a man out of himself and get him to take an interest in the affairs of the whole state, end quote, Alexis de Tocqueville once observed. Quote, but if it is a question of taking a road past his property, he sees at once that this small public matter has a bearing on his greatest private interests, end quote. It is only after we begin to see a street as our street, a public park as our park, a school as our school, that we can become engaged citizens, dedicating our time and resources for worthwhile causes. Joining the neighborhood watch, volunteering to beautify a playground, or running for school board. Working on behalf of the common good is the engine of democracy, vital to our communities, cities, states, and, ultimately, the nation. It is, quote, an outflow of the idealism and moralism of the American people, end quote, wrote Gunnar Martel. Some have called this impulse, quote, love of country, end quote, or, quote, patriotism, end quote, or the, quote, American spirit, end quote. But whatever its name, its foundation is the home. What else is a nation but a patchwork of cities and towns a patchwork of neighborhoods, and neighborhoods a patchwork of homes? America is supposed to be a place where you can better yourself, your family, and your community. But this is only possible if you have a stable home. When Scott was provided with an affordable apartment through the Guest House's permanent housing program, he was able to stay off heroin, find meaningful work as a resident manager for homeless people, and begin striving for independence. he remained stably housed and sober. And then there at the Hinkstons. And then there are the Hinkstons. After Malik Jr. was born, Patrice and Doreen finally moved to Brownsville, Tennessee, a town of about 10,000. They found a nice 3-bedroom place. Out of the rat hole, Patrice earned her GED, impressing her teacher so much that she was named Adult Learner of the Year. Patrice went to enroll in a local community college, where she took online classes in computers and criminal justice, hoping to one day become a parole officer. She liked to half joke, quote, "I got a lot of friends who are criminals who are going to need my help," end quote. The persistence and brutality of American poverty can be disheartening, leaving us cynical about solutions. But as Scott and Patrice will tell you, a good home can serve as the sturdiest of footholds. When people have a place to live, they become better parents, workers, and citizens. If Arlene and Vanetta didn't have to dedicate 70 or 80% of their income to rent, they could keep their kids fed and clothed and off the streets. They could settle down in one neighborhood and enroll their children in one school, providing them the opportunity to form long-lasting relationships with friends, role models, and teachers. They could start a savings account or buy their children toys and books, perhaps even a home computer. The time and emotional energy they spent making rent, delaying eviction, or finding another place to live when homeless could instead be spent on things that enrich their lives. Community college classes, exercise, finding a good job, maybe a good man too. But our current state of affairs, quote, reduces to poverty people born for better things, end quote. For almost a century, there has been broad consensus in America that families should spend no more than 30% of their income on housing. Until recently, most renting families met this goal. But times have changed, in Milwaukee and across America. Every year in this country, people are evicted from their homes not by the tens of thousands or even the hundreds of thousands, but by the millions. That brings us to a changing of the theme within this chapter, within the epilogue, so let's have a small reflection. So some of the social commentary that is contained in these first couple of pages of the epilogue, I think, are very powerful, and even more so powerful when conjoined with the stories and the experiences of people going through these things. I think that that's one of the aspects of the pieces of literature that we've read in Rockford Reading Daily podcast, and also that I've been introduced to in the last 2 years of struggling against police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice, that have been very impactful on me, is not just reading the social commentary or reading the ideology someone has, or reading about someone's belief system, but also reading about the people who experience the things that people are writing social commentary about, reading about the people who experience the things that people's ideology is formed on. Reading about, in the case of police terrorism, it's very powerful to read about the intricacies of police procedures and policies, but then also to read about the people who are impacted by those police procedures and policies, and what their lives are like before, during, and after these things have taken place. Same thing with mass incarceration. It's very powerful to learn about the criminal justice systems and the ins and outs of courtrooms, but it's even more powerful when you learn about the real everyday people who experience these things and whose lives are impacted by these things. The same thing with racial injustice. It's very powerful to learn about racist laws that have been put in place, racist ideology that has been put in place, but it's even more powerful learning those things when you can then learn about people whose lives have been impacted by those things. And I believe that those two things in connection with each other is what gives us is what turns the information into knowledge. And then once that has developed into knowledge, going out and interacting with these people who have experienced these things, going out and putting yourself in a position where you may be experience some of these things, is what turns that information and knowledge into education. And so for me, as I'm reading about some of just the strict social commentary that is being laid out here, it hits different after reading about these experiences that people have had. Okay, let's continue reading. Until recently, we simply didn't know how immense this problem was or how serious the consequences, unless we have suffered them ourselves. For years, social scientists, journalists, and policymakers all but ignored eviction, making it one of the least studied processes affecting the lives of poor families. But new data and methods have allowed us to measure the prevalence of eviction and document its effects. We have learned that eviction is commonplace in poor neighborhoods and that it exacts a heavy toll on families, communities, and children. Residential stability begets a kind of psychological stability, which allows people to invest in their home and social relationships. It begets school stability, which increases the chances that children will excel and graduate. And it begets community stability, which encourages neighbors to form strong bonds and take care of their block. But poor families enjoy little of that because they are evicted at such high rates. That low-income families move often is well known. Why they do is a question that has puzzled researchers and policymakers because they have overlooked the frequency of eviction in disadvantaged neighborhoods. Between 2009 and 2011, roughly a quarter of all the moves undertaken by Milwaukee's poorest renters were involuntary. Once you account for those dislocations, evictions, landlord foreclosure, low-income households move at a similar rate as everyone else. If you study eviction court records in other cities, you arrive at similarly startling numbers. Jackson County, Missouri, which includes half of Kansas City, saw 19 formal evictions a day between 2009 and 2013. New York City courts saw almost 80 non-payment evictions a day in 2012. That same year, 1 in 9 occupied rental households in Cleveland and 1 in 14 in Chicago were summoned to eviction court. Instability is not inherent to poverty. Poor families move so much because they are forced to. Along with instability, eviction also causes loss. Families lose not only their home, school, and neighborhood, but also their possessions, furniture, clothes, books. It takes a good amount of money and time to establish a home. Eviction can erase all of that. Arlene lost everything, Lorraine and Scott too. Eviction can cause workers to lose their jobs. The likelihood of being laid off is roughly 15% higher for workers who have experienced an eviction. If housing instability leads to employment instability, it is because the stress and consuming nature of being forced from your home wreak havoc on people's work performance. Often, evicted families also lose the opportunity to benefit from public housing because housing authorities count evictions and unpaid debt as strikes when reviewing applications. And so people who have the greatest need for housing assistance, the rent-burdened and evicted, are systematically denied it. This, the loss of your possessions, job, home, and access to government aid, helps explain why eviction has such a pronounced effect on what social scientists call, quote, material hardship, end quote, a measure of the texture of scarcity. Material hardship assesses, say, whether families experience hunger or sickness because food or medical care is financially out of reach, or go without heat, electricity, or a phone because they can't afford those things. The year after eviction, families experience 20% higher levels of material hardship than similar families who were not evicted. They go without food, they endure illness and cold. Evicted families continue to have higher levels of material hardship at least 2 years after the event. These families are often compelled to accept substandard housing conditions. In Milwaukee, renters whose previous move was involuntary were 25% more likely to experience long-term housing problems than similar renters who moved under less trying circumstances. And families forced from their homes are pushed into undesirable parts of the city, moving from poor neighborhoods into even poorer ones, from crime-filled areas into still more dangerous ones. Arlene's favorite place was nested in a working-class black neighborhood. After the city condemned it and forced her out, she moved into an apartment complex teeming with drug dealers. Even after controlling for a host of important factors, families who experience a forced move relocate to worse neighborhoods than those who move under less demanding circumstances. Concentrated poverty and violence inflict their own wounds, since neighborhoods determine so much about your life, from the kinds of job opportunities you have to the kinds of schools your children attend. Then there is the toll evictions take on a person's spirit. The violence of displacement can drive people to depression and, in extreme cases, even suicide. 1 in 2 recently evicted mothers reports multiple symptoms of clinical depression, double the rate of similar mothers who were not forced from their homes. Even after years pass, evicted mothers are less happy, energetic, and optimistic than their peers. When several patients committed suicide in the days leading up to their eviction, a group of psychiatrists published a letter in Psychiatric Services identifying eviction as a, quote, significant precursor of suicide, end quote. The letter emphasized that none of the patients were facing homelessness, leading the psychiatrists to attribute the suicides to eviction itself. Quote, eviction must be considered a traumatic rejection, end quote, they wrote. Quote, a denial of one's most basic human needs and an exquisitely shameful experience, end quote. Suicides attributed to evictions and foreclosures doubled between 2005 and 2010, years when housing costs soared. Eviction even affects the communities that displaced families leave behind. Neighbors who cooperate with and trust one another can make their streets safer and more prosperous, but that takes time. Efforts to establish local cohesion and community investment are thwarted in neighborhoods with high turnover rates. In this way, eviction can unravel the fabric of a community, helping to ensure that neighbors remain strangers and that their collective capacity to combat crime and promote civic engagement remains untapped. Milwaukee neighborhoods with high eviction rates have higher violent crime rates the following year, even after controlling for past crime rates and other relevant factors. Losing your home and possessions, and often your job, being stamped with an eviction record and denied government housing assistance, relocating to degrading housing in poor and dangerous neighborhoods, and suffering from increased material hardship, homelessness, depression, and illness. This is eviction's fallout. Eviction does not simply drop poor families into a dark valley, a trying yet relatively brief detour on life's journey. It fundamentally redirects their way, casting them onto a different and much more difficult path. Eviction is a cause, not just a condition, of poverty. Eviction affects the old and the young, the sick and able-bodied, but for poor women of color and their children, it has become ordinary. Walk into just about any urban housing court in America, and you can see them waiting on hard benches for their cases to be called. Among Milwaukee renters, over 1 in 5 black women report having been evicted in their adult life, compared with 1 in 12 Hispanic women and 1 in 15 white women. Most evicted households in Milwaukee have children living in them, and across the country, many evicted children end up homeless. The substandard housing and unsafe neighborhoods to which many evicted families must relocate can degrade a child's health, ability to learn, and sense of self-worth. And if eviction has lasting effects on mothers' depression, sapping their energy and happiness, then children will feel that chill too. Parents like Arlene and Vanetta wanted to provide their children with stability, but eviction ruined that, pulling kids in and out of school and batting them from one neighborhood to the next. When these mothers finally did find another place to live, they once again began giving landlords most of their income, leaving little for their kids. Families who spend more on housing spend less on their children. Poor families are living above their means in apartments they cannot afford. The thing is, those apartments are already at the bottom of the market. Our cities have become unaffordable to our poorest families, and this problem is leaving a deep and jagged scar on the next generation. And then that brings us to a changing of the theme within this chapter, so let's have a small reflection. So, this sentence here. Among Milwaukee renters, over 1 in 5 black women report having been evicted in their adult life, compared with 1 in 12 Hispanic women and 1 in 15 white women. And again, at the May 30th Alliance, we are struggling to combat police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. And I think sometimes people may see some of the books that we read and think to themselves, well, how does this fit into police terrorism, mass incarceration, or racial injustice? And on its face, the idea of evicted, poverty and profit in the American city may not seem like a issue that touches on any of those things. But as we've read through the book, we've seen how each one of those things has manifested in the issues of housing. And specifically, I think the racial injustice part really stands out to me. I had never read this book before. It's my first time reading it, but I've seen it in Barnes and Nobles, and it was a book that I wanted to read for the Rockford Reading Daily. Eventually, I don't know, I don't want to say community member, but a member of the May 30th Alliance got the book for us. A fellow member of the May 30th Alliance got the book for the organization, and had never read it before. I didn't really know anything about it except that it was about people being evicted, and I knew, and that it was based in Milwaukee, and I knew from the title and from where it was based in that it was a book that was going to touch on racial injustice issues, because I have learned enough to know that any issue that exists or manifests in this country, it is going to have a disproportionate effect on Black people and people of color. And throughout this book, we have seen that. And I think that that is one of the things that is the most important for us to be able to articulate, is to be able to explain to people how the issue of race exasperates other social issues that we have in our society. And so that's what stands out to me as reading through that sentence. Also, the mention here about the eviction being a significant precursor to suicides, and uh, the mental health aspect of all of these things. You know, there's a psychologically traumatizing component to police terrorism, to mass incarceration, and to racial injustice, and to all the things that exist within those issues. And so there's a psychologically traumatizing effect to evicting people out of their homes, to having police come and sheriffs come, showing up, taking things out of people's homes, to people being out on the streets, to people feeling this type of desperation and this anxiety. It has a negative impact on people's mental health. And we've seen that throughout this book, and it can lead to them making decisions that they would not have otherwise made without these things burdening them in the way that they do. And so that was very informative for me as well. And it also makes me think about the book Policing, or the book The End of Policing, and the chapter that was about policing mental health. And again, it's, I think one of the things that I do all these readings for regularly, and I hope other people are getting out of it, is getting a piece of information and being able to quickly cross-reference it to other pieces of information that we had. And on that note, before we get back to reading again, that makes me think about the section here that talked about how families being evicted from their homes also make the areas they live be less safe, or how it's destructive or not constructive for the areas that they leave behind, because it's harder for people to form these neighborhood communal ties and deal with neighborhood community issues. And that was one of the things that the book Citizens, Cops, and Power illustrated very well. The term that they used is transient. I think a lot of transient people, or it's a transient area, a lot of people coming and going, and how that can perpetuate violence or crime in certain areas. Okay, let's continue reading. We're going to read one more section, and then we'll wrap this episode up and finish the epilogue on tomorrow's episode and be all the way done with Evicted. All this suffering is shameful and unnecessary. Because it is unnecessary, there is hope. These problems are neither intractable nor eternal. A different kind of society is possible, and powerful solutions are within our collective reach. But those solutions depend on how we answer a single question. Do we believe that the right to a decent home is part of what it means to be an American? The United States was founded on the noble idea that people have, quote, certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, end quote. Each of these three unalienable rights, so essential to the American character that the founders saw them as God-given, requires a stable home. Life and home are so intertwined that it is almost impossible to think about one without the other. The home offers privacy and personal security. It protects and nurtures. The ideal of liberty has always incorporated not only religious and civil freedoms, but also the right to flourish, to make a living however one chooses, to learn and develop new skills. A stable home allows us to strive for self-reliance and personal expression, to seek gainful employment and enjoy individual freedoms. And happiness? It was there in the smile that flashed across Jory's face when Arlene was able to buy him a new pair of sneakers. In the church hymn Lorraine hummed when she was able to cook a nice meal. In the laughter that burst out of the Hingstons' house after a good prank. The pursuit of happiness undeniably includes the pursuit of material well-being. Minimally, being able to secure basic necessities. It can be overwhelming to consider how much happiness has been lost, how many capabilities snuffed out by the swell of poverty in this land and our collective decision not to provide all our citizens with a stable and decent place to live. We have a firm provision in old age, 12 years of education, and basic nutrition to be the right of every citizen because we have recognized that human dignity depends on the fulfillment of these fundamental human needs. And it is hard to argue that housing is not a fundamental human need. Decent, affordable housing should be a basic right for everybody in this country. The reason is simple. Without stable shelter, everything else falls apart. How can we deliver on this obligation? The good news is that much has already been accomplished. America has made impressive strides over the years when it comes to housing. In generations past, the poor crowded into wretched slums, with many apartments lacking toilets, hot water, heat, or windows. Death and disease were rampant. Over the generations, the quality of housing improved dramatically. And to address the problem of affordability, bold and effective programs were developed. In the middle part of the 20th century, housing was at the forefront of the progressive agenda. High-rise housing projects were erected to replace slums, sometimes in a single, massive sweep. Quote, cutting the ribbon for a new public housing project was an occasion to celebrate, end quote, the late housing economist Lewis Winnick remembered. Quote, big city mayors and aldermen trolled for votes by pledging a towering public housing project for the ward, end quote. When public housing residents saw their apartments, all airy and new, nested in complexes surrounded by expansive grassy fields and playgrounds, they were thrilled. Quote, it is a very beautiful place, end quote, one said. Quote, like a big hotel resort, end quote. But soon the great towers erected to replace slums became slums themselves. After politicians choked off funding, public housing fell into a miserable state of disrepair. Broken windows, plumbing, and elevators stayed that way. Outside, sewer openings were left uncovered and trash piled up. Families who could move did, leaving behind the city's poorest residents. Soon, public housing complexes descended into chaos and violence. It got to the point where the police refused to go to St. Louis's Pruitt-Igoe Towers, which would be demolished in front of a televised audience only 18 years after the first residents moved in. Across the United States, the wrecking ball and dynamite stick visited other infamous housing projects, such as Chicago's Robert Taylor Homes and Atlanta's McDaniel Glenn Homes, joyless towers casting shadows over segregated and desolate areas of their cities. Given what the projects had become, blowing them up was not only the cheaper option, it was the most humane one, like bulldozing a house in which some unspeakable thing had once transpired. Out of this rubble, the voucher program sprung to life. Whatever else vouchers were, they were not Pruitt-Igoe or Robert Taylor or all the public housing complexes that had come to be synonymous with urban violence, bitter poverty, and policy failure. Today, the federally funded Housing Choice Voucher Program helps families secure decent housing units in the private rental market. Serving over 2.1 million households, this program has become the largest housing subsidy program for low-income families in the United States. An additional 1.2 million families live in public housing. Cities such as Philadelphia, Seattle, and Oakland have reimagined public housing, often as low-rise, attractive buildings dispersed over several neighborhoods. By and large, both public housing residents and voucher holders pay only 30% of their income on rent, with government funds covering the remaining costs. Public initiatives that provide low-income families with decent housing they can afford are among the most meaningful and effective anti-poverty programs in America. Not every public housing resident or voucher holder is poor. Many are elderly or disabled. Others have modest incomes. But every year, rental assistance programs lift roughly 2.8 million people out of poverty. These programs reduce homelessness and allow families to devote more resources to health care, transportation, and food. When families finally receive housing vouchers after years on the waiting list, the first place many take their freed-up income is to the grocery store. They stock the refrigerator and cupboards. Their children become stronger, less anemic, better nourished. But the majority of poor families aren't so lucky, and their children children like Jory, Kendall, and Ruby are not getting enough food because the rent eats first. In 2013, 1% of poor livers lived in rent-controlled units, 15% lived in public housing, and 17% received a government subsidy, mainly in the form of a rent-reducing voucher. The remaining 67%, 2 of every 3 poor renting families, received no federal assistance. This drastic shortfall in government support, coupled with rising rent and utility costs alongside stagnant incomes, is the reason why most poor renting families today spend most of their income on housing. Imagine if we didn't provide unemployment insurance or Social Security to most families who needed these benefits. Imagine if the vast majority of families who apply for food stamps were turned away hungry. And yet, this is exactly how we treat most poor families seeking shelter. Okay, so we're going to end this episode here. And then I think we got 10 pages left to finish in the book. So the next episode, we will wrap it up no matter how long it goes. It might be about 40, 45-minute episode, but we'll wrap it up. And what stands out to me from this last piece of information we got is just the understanding the system of all the intricacies of the system of housing and how long it takes to understand those things, how long it takes to hear certain words and know the percentages from them or know how, it's because all of this information differs depending on the city, depending on the county, depending on the state. And I think the most important thing to do is to learn some of this specific information about the city that you're in, about the county that you're in, and then slowly expand out and learn it about other places. And I think that if we are working in coordination with other areas doing the same thing, it becomes easier to access this information. And then at that point, we can know what unique changes that we can make in our areas or what unique impacts we can make in our areas and our cities and communities to change some of these things. And so please share this on whatever platform that you're listening to it on. Like I said at the beginning of this episode, remember we put these episodes out on a daily basis to provide people the opportunity to begin or further their journey in the struggle against police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. And I will be back tomorrow.